Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining in on an afternoon of a weekend, which is your right to be lazy time. But the curiosity in you probably brought you here. So welcome. Um, I'll begin with telling you who we are for those who are joining us for the first time. This is episode 3 of Booked for Science, and this is brought to you by Science in Your City. Who we are, let me tell you very briefly. We are kind of a booked my show for science, if you will, and we basically are run this thing called Science in Your City is run by a purely on the passion of a bunch of science communicators. We believe that science is for everyone and everywhere. So it's best that people have all the information about public science events in one place. Like I said, a book my show for science events. So we have our Instagram page for which the link is now in the chat in case you haven't still followed us. We cover as many science events for the public as possible in all the cities of India as much as possible. So do share us on Instagram. We also have a WhatsApp channel by the same name and it has the same logo. So if you find us there, do follow us there too. And Booked for Science is basically an informal book chat show with the author of science books that are coming out to give them the due platform for talking about the process behind the science books that they're writing, and for the people who are interested in things like this to know, to get kind of a sneak peek into a book before you buy it. So that is that for you. Um, Today we bring you the third episode, like I said. So in case you want to catch the first two episodes of Booked for Science, that is also available on our YouTube channel, which looks again like this. And the first two episodes, the first one was with Dr. Karishma Kaushik on her book called The Real Deal. She's a very popular woman scientist and she talks about being in the sciences as a woman. And our episode 2 was with Upasana Saraju for the book called Unruly. It was about the Ig Nobel Prizes in the science, and it talks about a lot of weird science which you probably would not even think there is research going on about. So check in those first two episodes if you want to, after this one, of course. With that, I will now call in my dear co-host, Purti. Purti is, if I may say, kind of a cypreneur. She has been a science communicator for many, many years with different organizations. And now she runs Vigyan Vyanjan, a place where she makes science blogs, science explainers, and their latest offering are science-based games for kids and for adults alike. And her latest is a gene card game. So I welcome Purti and I also welcome Aparna, who has written the book featured today, Extraordinary Stories from Science of Everyday Life. So over to you, Purti.
Thanks, Nishta, for the free publicity that you did for me. So, Nishta is a science communicator and also a PhD. So, thank you everyone for joining in on a Saturday. And thank you, Aparna, for you also to be here on a Saturday afternoon. So, I'll tell you a bit about Aparna. So, she holds a PhD from NCBS and she worked with Deepa Agashe on evolutionary biology. She likes writing and she also does improv. So, second, yeah. And I completely loved reading the book Extraordinary. And as Aparna told me, she also had fun writing the book. And I would congratulate you, Aparna, for finishing this book in record time. Also, following the style of Terry Pratchett. I mean, different stories coming out in the footnotes itself. So that's like a great job that you have done. Uh,
Thank you. Thank you. That was, yeah, the footnotes, everything, they're all kind of like, Easter eggs for people who know me. But also, like, if people are fans of the same things I am, then they'll sort of pick up those things. But, like, also, I put things in footnotes which are just delightful. And I wanted to include them, but they're not necessarily part of the story.
yes.
And I think that's a like that's a really nice format that Terry Pratchett also used, where you don't break the flow of the story, but there's something very delightful as an aside that you can put in the footnotes. So I ended up using it as well.
Yeah, you can't wait to share with people reading your story, an extra story. Yeah. But I can't help notice that, so many things which you mentioned in the book, they also went viral. So is it like what Nishtha was saying, some kind of future prediction that you were doing? Or like
Yeah,
something
yeah.
just, happened. You picked up those
Yeah,
things
yeah.
strategically, which, led to
Very
go viral.
strategic. This is all AI. It's Aparna's intelligence.
Okay.
No, no, nothing like that. I was just, like I said, like I wrote this book more than a year ago. So I had no idea that what things are going to, nobody knows what is going to go viral a year from now. Um, so I just wrote about a lot of things and a lot of things that I find interesting. And I think in some way, like, we are all experiencing the whole social media and all of those things together in the world. Like, we end
Yes.
up seeing similar things. So, perhaps I was I was getting influenced by something, but there was actually like actively no effort made whatsoever. In fact, I was looking for things that are relatively timeless. Like, things that if you read about it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they still seem relevant. They still seem like just common sense questions that I'm sure people are still asking.
Yes. Right. But again, I could not help notice this that, yeah. So all these pink photos of Bangalore, and I was surprised, to see. I had to check if are those like AI generated. Turned out no, they're not. And then I happened to also read how this pink Bangalore, cherry blossom Bangalore thing mentioned in the book itself. So maybe you can tell us the tale of what these cherry blossoms in Bangalore are.
Yeah, they're actually not cherry blossoms. They're called Tabebuia rosea, and I think they're from Central America, if I'm not
I'm not
wrong.
sure.
Um, and they were actually brought to India by a German horticulturist called Gustav Krumbigel. And the whole idea was that in Bangalore, they wanted to create a city that blooms throughout the year. So Bangalore already had so many trees and flowers and things that bloomed in different season and a lot of perennial stuff that blooms all the time. And then they wanted to actually sort of bring in, seeds and plants from all over the world that fit into that schedule wherever there were gaps in Bangalore, so that from January to December, there's always something blooming in Bangalore. And that's true. Like if you go take a walk in a neighborhood like Jayanagar or Cooktown or near Cubbon Park in Bangalore, there's always like trees that are just full of like um, flowers. In January to like now, Marchish, there's these pink flowers. Then around, like you also have their yellow cousins, which are called the tabebuyas as well. And then you also have like a lot of Indian flowers. You have Pride of India. You have the temple flowers, plumeria, all those blooming, in a cycle in Bangalore. And of course, there is some conversation about the fact that, now we understand that these are invasive species and they were brought into a city, and, how that affects sort of the local climate and everything. That is a completely different conversation as well. But they've also been here for like 100 years or so. So at this point, like, they're as Bangalorean as it gets. Um, you anybody who's grown up here in the last 2 or 3 generations would be like, yeah, of course these trees are Bangalorean. What do you mean they're not? Right? So yeah, just it's a I don't know. It was just a thread that I kept pulling on, and it just led me into a very weird rabbit hole where I'm just finding more and more, when all I wanted to ask was what are these flowers? Why? Because like, in if you can see even in this picture, the tree completely gets covered by flowers. It sheds all of its leaves and everything. So that's sort of what really got me curious about these trees in the first place. And I was just like, what are these flowers? And so that sort of got me started. And it ended up unraveling this whole story for me, at least. I'm sure other people already knew about it.
Yeah, those look like roads in Japan. Doesn't look like Bangalore to me.
Yeah, that I think that brings us to another Japan or Japanese inspired thing that trended later, which was Studio Ghibli. And I'm pretty sure a lot of us would have publicly or otherwise tried to create our own Ghibli portraits when Gen AI was getting very trendy very recently. Aside from all the safety concerns that it brought up and all the art being stolen conversation behind it. This is another one of the viral things that you talk in the book. And so let's hear it from a big time fan again, I guess, of Studio Ghibli. And it's really beautiful how you portray how you feel while watching a Ghibli piece of work. So it was really, really nice to read that. And we'd like to know
Yeah.
more about it from you, Aparna.
Yeah. So again, like weirdly, I was doing the same kind of making a portrait. I actually no, not making a portrait in a Ghibli style, but so like the way I try to paint, and I don't end up learning very well in classes. So how I often learn is that, like, if I'm really enjoying watching a movie or something, I'll often take like a screenshot from it, and especially like it's very very helpful to do it in a Ghibli frame because they were all hand painted frames anyway. So, if you pause any frame, you basically have a full painting. So, what I would do is I would take that painting and I would try to replicate it with watercolors. Um, and, you know, that makes you really like slow down and notice and see where the shadows are coming and and not just where the shadows and light is coming, but like how is it been portrayed by the artist who's painted it, right? If you stare at it long enough, you start seeing brush strokes, you start seeing what is the way in which somebody's painted it, what is the style. You can start seeing those. So if you look at even Studio Ghibli movies, right? Like sometimes there will be between movies, I'll be like, oh, this frame looks like that person painted it. I don't know who that person is, but like that style is very visceral in my head because I sat down and I would paint and I would try to see. And then, like in the book, I talk about how in Ghibli frames, if you see even the frames that you see here, right, they evoke a lot of emotion. But if you actually zoom in into like any of the pictures or whatever, there isn't that much detail,
Hmm.
right? And that, in fact, on a neuroscience level, works out better for our brain because when we have suggestions of a face, right, when we have just light and shadow, which is more of a suggestion of like a shape or a face. Our brains are excellent pattern recognition devices. So they just sort of take that and they'll fill in the details and they'll make the character feel authentic. And as long as we get just the light and darkness correct, the rest of information, our brain fills it. Of course, that doesn't take away from the skill. There's a lot of skill involved to sort of get that. Like I just say it's simply getting the shadow and light right, but everybody spends their entire life just getting that balance
Yes.
correct.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I talk about this, how this is not something that only Studio Ghibli artists use. This is something that has been used in art for centuries, even before we found out about you know what is the way in which we perceive depth, what is the way in which humans are perceiving how faces are and all of that. Even before that, like artists were using the same technique, so they might not have known the scientific reasoning for why this works, but humans have a great intuition of what looks right and what doesn't look right. And I think a lot of artists go by that gut feel of like, I'm painting this and this doesn't look right, or this looks right. And just based on that, you can come up with techniques that, like, later on we get validation from science, finding out why it works, right? And this is something that happened within early animation, when they started putting in too much detail and they started to get like 3D rotating models and all of that. Those things just didn't sit well with people, because it's sort of, if you start having detail but you don't have enough detail, then we go into something called the uncanny valley. So
Mm,
the uncanny valley is basically where our brains can recognize that this is a face, but the details aren't quite exactly right.
Mhm.
So it feels foreign to our brain. So
Right.
so if you keep it simple, and if it's just a suggestion of it and your brain is filling it, it's fine. If there is perfect detail where you've captured every single thing, it's fine. But if you go just a little below that, which is where the early animation model went, it's very bizarre. And that's also why, painting a portrait is incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Even like, when you see people do caricatures, you'll often say, now, oh, this person's doing a good job, this person's doing a bad job. What is a good job or a bad job? At the end of the day, they're making a few lines, right? Why does it look like one person versus that other? Because just that slight balance, our brains can pick up the whole thing of whether it's right or wrong. That's about it. Not why does it look right or wrong.
yeah,
Yeah, I
that's
guess, I mean, this is so primitive and so ingrained in the way we think that it's just so subconscious. I think even besides artists, people who don't paint themselves, or and probably not even connoisseurs, but people who look at a lot of animation or art, they also sometimes feel unsettled looking at something,
Hmm.
so they know like this is not quite right. So the
Yeah.
appreciation of that form of art also comes from the same neuroscience working in both the observer and the artist, I feel, the audience and the artist. And
Yeah.
Ghibli has done a really good job of saying more with less. So yes,
Hmm.
entirely. I mean, this is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation is going great, Nishtha. But if
Um,
you remember, somebody had been upset with you because
yeah.
you didn't know that dogs don't see in black and white.
Oops.
And that's why Oreo had told me to bring it up because he wants to make it clear that we're talking about Studio Ghibli, fine. But I think there has been another thing which has been going viral for dog parents, other than the regular videos that we keep on watching, is Dewey. So, Parna, I think he told me, कि, okay, let my mama now tell the entire story about Dewey and if dogs see black and white. So, please go ahead.
Yeah. No, so even this, right? Like, one of the things that, so just the structure of the book for the people who've not read the book, or don't know what the book is about. The structure of the book is that you spend a day with me and my dog, Oreo. And since I have a brain that is half of a scientist and half of an artist, I sort of end up combining a lot of different things that people don't tend to put who's following me around, and I try to see what would he be feeling about this, what would he look at this and think. And so, like, one of the things that is, a myth, that dogs see in black and white, which is not true. They can see color. What happens is that one of the most prominent colors for us, which is red, that is a color that dogs can't see. So we have a trichromatic vision, which means we have red, green, blue cones in our eye. But not green, blue, yellow, sorry. But dogs only have blue and yellow. And they have a dichromatic cones, which means that in their eyes, they also have, like, compared to humans, most dogs are technically like nearsighted. So we can see much farther than them. They can only see things that are closer to them. But then, of course, like dog vision, there is a whole thing where, what I think part of the reason why this myth would have started in the first place is because they can see, like, between 20 to 100 times better than humans in the dark. So, and that's because of multiple reasons. One of them is that they have this reflective layer at the back of their retinas that just doesn't let that much light escape. So, for us, whatever light just escapes, it just sort of stays and helps them, make sense of the world a lot more. And then, of course, their sense of smell. And now there are all these things where dogs can detect cancer and they can detect like pregnancy long before the humans know about it. Which is, yeah. And it's also like, it kind of makes sense also that dogs are so attuned to us, because one of the things that I found out while writing this book, which I did not know before, was that like dogs are our oldest animal companions. Like, earlier I used to think maybe it was agriculture and maybe, it was cows and buffaloes and all of those things that we raised before. And then, just like if we needed a guard, like when we needed a guard dog, when we were sort of maybe rearing sheep or something, at that time, maybe dogs uh, were domesticated. But actually, dogs and humans have had like a really long dance of coevolution for a very very long time. They were the oldest like animal companions that humans had. And there is some, not evidence but theories about the fact that early dogs might have in fact helped us domesticate like cows and those larger animals, because humans would not have been able to do it on their own.
Okay, I didn't know this.
That I knew.
Smarter than us. Okay.
For both the dog moms here.
Oreo
That
is
fact
saying
I
good
knew.
for you, Nishka.
And I think this reminds me of how you see videos of guard dogs helping on farms to kind of shepherd cattle into their
Uh,
spaces at the end of the day. Makes a lot of sense.
yeah, that's why like German Shepherd and other
Yeah,
Shepherd names come from. So.
right.
Yeah, no, so that's also why like I feel like especially like dogs are specially attuned to humans. And a lot of the times there is this question, okay, like especially as a dog parent, when you're sort of talking to people. I am a vegetarian, but I know like, and I but like I feed my dog like meat and stuff. So people are like, oh, how can you love one animal but not care for another animal, which is a whole other debate, altogether. But this unique thing of like, how humans respond to dogs. If evolutionarily we've had a companionship for so long, and we also selected them specifically for companionship. So early wolves, one of the evolutionary pressures that was put on them was companionship of humans, of children, you
Hmm.
know, uh, and even in humans, like mostly women. So it sort of, kind of makes sense that there's something primitive where, this kind of bonding that happens with an animal. And of course, there's a completely different whole answer to the other question, but, you know.
But so do dogs watch cartoon or not?
It
Does
depends, I
Oreo
think.
watch or not?
Oreo is not a screens person. He grew up without screens. He
Good.
grew up with a human who's very like anti-screens for children and puppies. So he just never learned that like something on the screen is real.
Good, good, good that he'll save all of us from all that blue screen time. And since we're talking so much about blue, which happens to be a color I really love also, I mean, I'm recalling that one is, why does Oreo really see the sky to be blue the same way that we do? And also, I remember reading that color blue doesn't really exist in nature. I don't remember
Mhm.
reading this in any textbook growing up or even during college time, despite being a science student. So, what is that all about?
Yeah. So like I say in my book, this statement that the color blue did not exist is 100% true and completely false at the same time. And I will tell you one part of it, and if you want to know the other part, you either have to read the book or you can just Google it. But essentially, the part of it which says that the color blue did not exist, the theory comes from some. So it's a very interesting story. People started counting words that were in ancient Greek myths. Okay, and they wanted to use that as an understanding of what were the words that were more commonly used in in that time versus what were the words that were not so commonly used. And what they found was that there were almost no references to the color blue. Like there was no word for the color blue. In fact, in the Iliad, Homer described the sea, which we would assume as blue, as the wine gray sea. Uh, and But at the same time, you have like, of course, the wavelength for blue always existed, right? So saying that, oh, the ancient Greeks did not see blue, that just doesn't make sense. But it was actually one of the theories that people purported for some time, which was pushed down. Uh, what I think is happening is that, in a lot of ancient languages, they just didn't have a word for blue, for the color blue. And it might seem strange to us now because we live in a society where blue is everywhere. Like right now, I can see there's a blue umbrella in front of me, and there is blue jeans. My dog's food bowl is blue. There's a whole, conversation. All three of us are wearing the color blue. But in reality, in nature, the color blue is very, very rare. It's not it's not there very commonly, and that's mostly because you know the particular wavelength of light that corresponds to the color blue, that is what is absorbed by the plants to make energy. So
Hmm.
we associate the color green with plants, but in fact green is the wavelength that they are reflecting away. They're actually absorbing all the blue, and so because of that, having something reflect blue is a very, very costly thing for a plant to do. And
True.
so that's why you don't have too many uh, blue things in nature. Now, of course, you might come at me and say, hey, we have a picture of the sky right here. Of course it's blue, what do you mean it's not? But you have to think about it in terms of, if you live in a world where you don't see the color anywhere except the sky, then you can just call it the sky color. You don't need to have a name for it, right?
Hmm.
And in fact, if we look at multiple sort of, you know, languages across the globe, one of the pattern that emerges is that humans name the color blue a lot later. So typically, the way in which humans name things is that you will have something that separates light and dark.
Hmm.
So, that's the first thing. Like if you have a language, the first thing that will be differentiated is to identify whether something's light or dark. And then you'll have like the colors of what typically fruits are. So reds and yellows and, perhaps greens. And blue gets named a lot later.
Ah, okay.
And so that is the reason for saying blue did not exist, because people just didn't use the term blue. And that also, in my opinion, kind of made the color disappear a little bit, because when you don't have a particular name for something, you don't tend to actively notice it as much. So, also in terms of the sky is not this color throughout the day, right? Like
Yeah,
half of
yeah.
the time it's overcast, half of the time it's gray, half of the time it's black. So the sky is also not consistently blue.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's in it's and it's also sometimes orange and pink and purple and at twilight it's a different blue, at dusk it's a slightly different blue. Yeah, that's very interesting.
No,
Yeah,
but that's
definitely.
true about language. I mean, depending on what language you have, learned with time as you grew up, there are some other things like emotions which you probably obviously are feeling, but don't have the words to describe it. And at times, I think again, this is also something which has been going on in Insta for a long time that I'm seeing. How you feel that kind of depends on what language you have learned. So I think there are some similarities in that, and what you are saying about the color blue, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
People who are bilingual, trilingual feel like the whatever is there in their mother tongue, they can't express the same thing, or the same depth of emotion or feeling in another language. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So,
Yeah,
I
there's
think we
also,
carry on.
sorry, no, there's also this thing of if you have a language that has like gendered words for objects, the areas of your brain that light up when you think of that object, they can either correspond to like just place, or sometimes if it's a gendered thing, it will correspond to like the amygdala and the emotion center as well. And of
Oh.
course, these are very crude,
Wow.
very like things, but there is some differences there as well.
Is that your topic for the next book? No?
Yeah, maybe we'll find out.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we've already done a lot of talking. So maybe it's time to get our audience also involved a bit. And so, yes. So we've been talking about things that went viral after Aparna's book came out, but she also strategically chose some of the things which already had been viral. So now what we're going to do is I will be showing two photos, and after you see the photo, you can type in the chat box about what is it basically showing, and if you guess it right, after that Aparna is going to then tell you a bit more about how she connected some of those things with other things in the book. So I can then go in for the first photo. We'll probably meet half a minute after showing the photo
Yeah,
and
that should be good.
then talk about it.
Ready, guys?
Yes. So for all the
Let's
people
go.
who are into series, this one is coming.
Oh, damn. I've never. Okay.
Can you look at the chats, Nishta? Not able to
Yes.
screen
I
share.
will. I will check the chats. Come on, guys. Which series is this? Yes. And what is there on the right? What is the thing on the right specifically? Right, Purti? That's what we are looking for.
Yes, yes. You seem to be
The
having
object
a
on
good
the
time
right,
quizzing people.
what is it made of? Um, Anything like that. Titanium and Lord of the Rings is what Rajat says.
Oh, did we choose the wrong picture?
That is for you to tell.
Yes. Nobody else. We're all
Nobody.
scientists in here.
I don't know. There are like 11 people besides us. I'll be very surprised if, like me, a lot of other people haven't watched this series.
Have you watched it?
No.
Oh. So should I then reveal the answer if nobody got it right?
Yeah, I think we
So
should.
this is from Game of the Thrones, and there was this special element, Valyrian steel, that features in the show,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a connection with that with a pillar in Delhi. Aparna, is that correct?
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So Valerian steel is actually based on a type of steel that was used in India to make swords, in fact. And this is like a really ancient rust-proof technique of making steel that is now kind of lost to time. So, there were these Indian swordsmiths that used to make swords that would just not rust. And it was considered a really, really prized possession for anybody, like all the emperors and anybody else in the world. And it used to be like one of those really prized things that was traded. And then now, of course, that knowledge is kind of lost to time. But even then, we know that like a lot of ancient metallurgy in India was very advanced. They were using temperature control. They were using a lot of kilns and stuff to sort of make sure that the temperatures were maintained. And that was again, like it might be one of those things where we don't know whether they knew the mechanism behind it or not, or whether it was artisans who just had this singular notion of making something strong, making something more durable and whatever. And through, like, just like evolution, you just have something that works and then you sort of try and replicate it. And over the years, with generations of people working on it, you perfect some technique. And even today, like, a lot of the technology that's used in mining, there is some evidence that you know when we had a lot of Silk Route trading, those kind of things were already happening. um, and so this just was a funny nugget for me, that this Valerian steel, this might actually be based on a real thing that was made here in India.
Yeah. Our audience is catching up with, well, isn't Valerian steel fictional? Well, yes, it is, but it does probably get inspiration from real world science, is what Aparna is getting to. I think we have another one, Purti.
Yes, we do. That's for the scientists.
Okay. Okay, who can tell us what this picture is about? Do you remember seeing it not so recently, but
Yeah, couple of years back.
in the near past?
Oh, yes, we have looked.
Women of ISRO, yes. Yup. Mangalyaan. This actually, is this Mangalyaan or Chandrayaan launch, Purti?
I think this was Mangalyaan.
You think it was Mangalyaan? Okay. We'll still give it
You're
to
not.
everyone who's saying ISRO or Women of ISRO or Chandrayaan or Mangalyaan because yes, it is from ISRO and it is a photo from the launch. And this brings me to a little bit more philosophical slash what the public thinks of scientists angle of about things that Aparna talks in the book. So people can again tell us in the chat, like when you saw this picture for the first time, did this match with your expectation of what scientists look like? Because all these women and men are actually scientists. They are engineers and scientists, researchers. And we hear a lot, like all of us who have done PhDs or who are related to research somehow, get to know that this is not how people picture scientists in their head. Like they're supposed to be wearing lab coats, they have some kind of test tube in their hand or something like that, and they just don't look like ordinary people, right? So that is one thing I wanted to ask. And another thing which is very palpable in in this picture is the emotion behind the successful launch, right? And God knows how much effort has gone into it. Of course, these people know. And Aparna talks somewhere towards the end of the book about scientists or researchers being thought of as emotionless beings, like very cold, very methodical, logical, meticulous, but not emotional. So, Aparna, would you like to talk about that? Because that hits a raw nerve with me, at least.
Yeah. I'll tell you one story before I begin this, okay? When I first, so I've always been that person, that like they say in Hindi movies, मुझे ना singing और dancing का बड़ा ही शौक रहता है.
I know.
I can't sing, but that like that. But when my mother came to sort of drop me for my PhD interview, she was like, "How will you survive here? You to like dancing and wearing colorful clothes." And
There you have it.
And I had to tell her that no, it's okay, I'll be fine. But like when I was joining PhD, I also had that kind of fear. Like, of course, in front of her, I became all like, no, no, it's fine. Like, I want to do this. This is something that's important to me and all of that. But in my head, I also was like, oh, I'll have to change myself and I'll have to present myself a certain way if I have to be accepted. And what I found was like, I think completely the opposite, where like, you have all these people who are cracking the worst speeches I've ever heard in my life, and who are like, extremely affected by small things in terms of, looking at the beauty of something and admiring it, and
Mm,
being, and of course, being very driven and very, methodical, and, you know, looking at things in a very logical manner, but at the same time holding the emotion, holding the laughter, holding that sort of warmth that's there in just humans, right? And of course that's not the case with everybody, because again, just like humans, there are certain people who are more expressive and there are certain people who are just not that expressive, and that kind of is there in scientists as well. In any kind of people, if you take a subset, some of them will have this whole thing of, expressing every thought that comes to their head, and some people like to just, think internally. But this whole thing of scientists not being emotional is, I think it's just not right, in my opinion. Because, like, I write this in the book also, that art and science, they're both our ways of writing love letters to the universe. They always have been. And to say that one does not love the universe and that's why they choose to do science is completely the opposite. You have to be this hopeless romantic. You have to stand at the edge of all knowledge and say, "This is something we don't know yet." Love something enough to put, your hours and your problem nobody else in the world is looking at, and keep doing it while you're being hit by failure again and again. How can you say these people are not romantics?
yeah, romantics are a different kind of a thing, but definitely romantics. That's true. And another thing that, I feel the one emotion that is very strong in people who end up in research is basically curiosity, right? And just the drive to know why or how, or like why not this and why that. So a lot of question, a lot of wish to learn more. And sometimes you, like you said, you reach the edge of knowledge that humans have right now, and then you want to push a little further. And a lot of times, curiosity also comes out in, for example, why is a certain thing a certain way may not tell us immediately something useful. Like medicines are not created in one day, and it may not come up with a new treatment, it may not come up with a new kind of technology, but just following curiosity itself is a huge endeavor in itself. And so we come to this debate that usually comes up about pure research or basic research, which is just answering questions irrespective of what the question is, whether it is going to turn into something useful or not, and versus something called translational research, which is essentially going to create products and services which are of direct use to the public right now. And the case goes against pure research a lot of times, and you talk about it in the book as well. And I'd like to read just two sentences from it. You say that pure research doesn't always give you the answers you're looking for. Sometimes it doesn't give you answers at all. But every so often, it leads you somewhere unexpected and wonderful. So I think that kind of sums up why people end up in science and research at all. And as readers of science books, I think we are still in the same chase, trying to find out new things and, satiating our curiosity somehow. And you can share a few more thoughts about that, Aparna, about pure research and where curiosity takes us.
Yeah, no, I think I genuinely believe that everybody is born a scientist and everybody is born an artist, and they're not two different things anyway.
Yes.
Um, and I think it is because all you need to be a scientist is curiosity. The rest is just stuff you pick up. Um, because, and so I think what people don't understand is that translational research, when it comes to the point where something is now being able to made into something useful for humans. That's basically what the definition for translational research is. It comes from a place where a question was just being asked because of curiosity, where there was some pure research going on, right? Um, so, and there are so many different examples of this. Uh, Just something as simple as something that's again very viral right now, the whole Ozempic thing, right?
Oh, yeah,
The
yeah.
GLP-1 peptides, they were found in the spit of a salamander, or the Gila monster. And it was mostly being studied just not for like finding out fat loss or whatever. They just saw that the peptide structure to the human peptide, right?
Right.
And that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Um, so if you don't let your curiosity lead the way, if you don't just randomly go and try and find out what is there in the spit of the Gila monster, you'll never have options to then try for a drug later on.
Yeah.
How will you build the drug if you don't know the world around you?
Yep. Yeah. That reminds me of two things. One is very recent, the CRISPR-Cas9 technology. I don't know how much our audience might know about it, but the very latest in gene editing technology, which was actually, it was just found out because someone decided to see that how do bacteria fight viral infection and what is in their genome that kind of goes
Mhm.
against any infection. Like just like we have an immune system, how do bacteria do that? So that was also purely out of curiosity that endeavor started. And I think curiosity and observation, these two things, because um, the story of the discovery of penicillin from spoiled culture plates is another
Mhm.
very common example of this. So yeah, that is a very nice note to finish talking about the book on. Purti, do we have
Uh,
something else?
we have time for questions. So if there are questions from our audience about the book, or they want to share any extraordinary facts with us, so now we have some time left for that. So you can type in the chat box.
Yes.
So we'll
Or
wait.
you can ask Aparna any other ordinary things which might have an extraordinary science behind them.
Yeah, I
Something
mean,
that you wondered about.
honestly, I was like, how can you put in so many things together and
Yeah.
also kind of structure them in a way that you don't feel overwhelmed? So it's like a tremendous job. I'm like still surprised how she managed to pull that off. But I think, oh, I can see
I
Oreo.
think the co-conspirator is here with us on screen, guys.
Hey, he woke up. I think
Yes.
somewhere being with dogs, you get that time to be in the present. And then you can actually, go on these mental walks, thinking of all the things around you. And yeah,
Yeah.
so probably, Nishtha, if you have any more questions, I don't see anyone typing or any questions coming up. So
Yeah.
anything which we didn't ask, Aparna?
Anything that you would like to share specifically?
Um, sure. I mean, I uh, read the book.
Yes, yes.
Of course.
It's a fun read. Like Purti said, it is not heavy at all. It is meant for everyone. So the idea is that anybody with or without a science background should be able to read and understand it. So I don't ever use any kind, like if I use any terms or whatever, they are described right there in the book. So you don't have to. go and Google things. You might want to Google things saying, is this actually true or is this person just making this shit up?
I've done that.
Uh,
Yes. So many times.
oh, you didn't trust me, is it?
No, I mean, after reading this about flamingos, so I love flamingos. And I'm
Mm.
surprised to know that the pink color is coming from their food. So I was like
Mhm.
totally blown away. So I wanted to check. I think
Yeah,
after
no.
I trusted you.
No, it's perfectly fine. Like honestly, I still sometimes go back and check things, and I'm like, am I like, is this sure? And I'm sure I got some things wrong, and like we'll find out maybe in the future or whatever. But my and this is something that also I talk about in science, that you sort of have to make a case based on the knowledge you have currently.
Yeah.
And then sometimes when you look at it through hindsight, um, things look like obviously this was wrong. But what we forget is that any scientist is making a case based on the knowledge that we have in the present. So it's not fair to sort of try to look at it through the lens of hindsight and be like, obviously this was wrong.
Yes.
Yep. And I vouch for that. I think the book is really simple, very light read. And another thing I like about the book is that the print is not too fine, guys.
You
I
have
like
disappeared.
prints with like, can I just see it? I am old. But yeah, another thing I like is that it's very light and it looks light. It's light on the eyes as well.
I
And
did I did give them a little bit of an opinion on the font. So
oh, good. Way to
That's
go.
the artist in you.
Yes. And
yeah.
Oreo will also come and go in pieces in parts of the book, so it's a fun read.
Yeah. It's mostly a book about Oreo and then science is there.
Yeah, of course. Because it's a part of everyday life anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's where our world revolves. Once you have a dog, that's like your life. Everything you do is going to be a part of that thing. So,
Yeah. I don't think it's a dog also. It's any pet.
Any pet, yeah.
so I think we then can wrap up the chat with Aparna. And I think, Nishta, we have an announcement to make. Or I'll just share my screen.
Yes. Share your screen and we'll make that announcement.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who's been here appreciating the talk. We enjoy it as much as you guys do, at least, I hope. And for episode 4, we would like to announce the next book called From Myths to Science, The Evolving Story of the Universe by none other than Gohar Raza. The date will come out on our Instagram page, so stay tuned for that. Do register. It'll be free, just like the 3 episodes you have seen till now. And follow us on Instagram, WhatsApp, stay in touch, and follow us. Never miss a science event in your city. And stay tuned. Appease the nerdy side of yourself, right? And do something different next time you want to go out in the city. Thanks for joining in, and we'll take your leave now. Bye bye. Thank you,
Thank
Aparna, for joining in and being so candid with us. We loved it.
Thank
And
you.
Oreo's special appearance made it all the more special. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.